Hello, everyone. You are watching CoinDesk's Policy and Regulation Show. I'm Jen Sanasi here with my co-host Renato Mariotti, and we are here every second week bringing you the latest and greatest in crypto regulation and policy. Renato, great to see you. As always, how's it going?
I'm doing well. Man, there's so much going on, Jen. It seems like every week we're just flooded with news.
Every week we are flooded with news, and I would like to note the government is still shut down. So even though they're still shut down, things are still moving along. Um, I would like to say the biggest regulation and policy news of the day is that Binance founder CZ has been pardoned by President Trump. Now, our audience will remember back in 2023, he pleaded guilty to enabling money laundering while he was the CEO of Binance. And at the time, well, not at the time, even now, the biggest DOJ settlement took place here. His plea was part of a $4.3 billion settlement. So for anyone who wants to follow the latest on that story, you can head on over to coindesk.com. We will have all of the details as they emerge as it pertains to CZ's pardon. All right, let's get right to our first guest. I just mentioned that the government is still shut down, but some of the top digital assets executives were in Washington yesterday. They met with both Senate Democrats and Republicans to discuss moving the market structure bill forward. Joining us now is one of the executives who was in attendance, the president of the Solana Policy Institute, Kristin Smith. Hello.
Good morning, Jen. Good morning, Renato. Great to be here.
Great to have you on the show. We mentioned that you were in Washington yesterday. I know that you've said both sides want to accomplish the same thing. You call this rare. Talk to me about the common goals that you heard yesterday.
Yeah, well, the origin of this meeting yesterday is that there had been, I guess, some hurt feelings on both sides between the industry, between the Democrats, and even on the Republicans about language that would go about DeFi regulation in a way that is just unworkable. And so the purpose of this meeting was to reset the conversation around market structure more broadly. And as a result, the Democrats convened 10 executives to meet. We had 12 senators in the room who are interested in pro-crypto policy. And it was a really good conversation where different parties in the room got to talk about their top priorities and why we wanted to see this move forward. Similarly, the Republicans held one in the afternoon. Listen, I think that their market structure is not an easy road, right? Like it's really, really, really important that we get this right because this is going to be the framework where everything is regulated for years to come. But I do think the encouraging thing is the meetings had their intended purpose. The conversations are open. Everyone is committed to working to get this done. And now we need to go through the next steps of more education in the areas where the senators feel like they have a misunderstanding. And then also putting pen to paper and getting them to a point. So it's going to be a sprint to the end of the year. And if it goes into next year, I'm of a differing opinion. Like, I think it's okay. I think it's more important to get this right. But the important thing is everyone is talking again and the discussions are back on track.
So, Kristen, there are some, I would think, encouraging aspects to the reporting that I've seen about these meetings. Obviously, at least 6 Democrats need to vote for market structure in order for it to get to the president's desk. There was more than that in attendance. 10, I think, at least 10 Democrats, from what I read. Senator Chuck Schumer, the minority leader, also attended. Help us understand, because that's going to be key here. Where do you see the Democratic Party right now, and Democratic senators? Do you think that there is enough support to get market structure passed?
I mean, I think ultimately, yes, if we're going to get it done, we're going to need to have Democrats support the bill, right? You need 60 votes in the Senate. And I think we're only at 53 or so Republicans right now. And so, this is something where Democrats have to be at the table. I think I think Republicans are approaching this from a point of view as they want to move very quickly. I think Democrats would like to have some more time. They want to feel like they are part of the process, and they have their own ideas on what needs to be included. But even more than that, I do think there are a lot of senators who want to be involved that just haven't had enough time to digest the proposals that are out there or get deep on the technology. And so there is a learning gap there. And I think, listen, the industry, I ran the Blockchain Association for 7 years before coming over to Solana Policy Institute. There's been a lot of education that's been done, but this is, as we know, an incredibly fast-moving space, and we want to be sure that these senators feel comfortable and confident about where the technology is so that they can get the legislative framework in place that works to keep the U.S. As a leader in this technology.
You mentioned that education gap. Can you tell us a little bit more based on your conversations where that education gap kind of lies? Like, what is the sticking point? Is it DeFi? Is it something else?
Yeah, well, I think there's sort of two things. One is around DeFi and how that works as a technology. If you look throughout history, intermediaries are often the subject of regulation, and so they are sort of the tool that helps achieve public policy goals. So it's a little bit different when we're looking at these disintermediated systems where there are no middlemen, and so we have to think of different ways to achieve those same public policy goals. The good news is a lot of what we're looking for can be, is already part of these networks. I think there's also, maybe as a second issue, is around illicit finance. There is a misunderstanding as to what tools are available and how these networks are different, and therefore we need different ways to track down the bad guys. I think, if you look at the numbers, it's a lot less in the crypto space than it is in the traditional space, and so this is a good thing. But I think what happens is senators often sort of focus on their top areas of concern, and they're looking to an old menu of solutions when really we need to go into the kitchen and make up some new things to address any outstanding concerns. But the reality is the tools we have in the crypto world are better than the tools we have in the TradFi world. And that is a feature, not a bug. And we should continue to support the tools that we have.
So from my perspective, Kristin, the elephant in the room when it comes to market structure is, where is the Senate Agriculture Committee draft? That has been holding things up for quite a while now. And for our viewers who aren't aware, the Senate Agriculture Committee has jurisdiction over the CFTC. They're the ones who are ultimately overseeing the CFTC. So what is your understanding of where that draft is and when we're going to see it? Because of course that plays into the timing and the process.
Yeah, well, and I would say, there weren't many Agriculture Committee members in the room yesterday. There were on the Democratic side, but not in the Republican meeting. I think that the Senate Agriculture Committee is very much thinking about this, and I know that David Sachs, it was reported, who's the crypto and AI czar at the White House, he had meetings with members of the Agriculture Committee yesterday about moving this forward. I think this kind of comes back to something you were talking to earlier. There is a government shutdown going on right now. And so that means on the executive branch side, which includes the independent agencies like the SEC and the CFTC, they're operating with less than 10% of their staff. And so the technical assistance that the Senate Agriculture Committee needs from the CFTC to draft this bill isn't there. Moreover, there are fellows that have been detailed to the Senate Agriculture Committee to help craft this legislation. They are on furlough. This is very different than the congressional staff, by the way, who are not a part of the government shutdown because they're part of the legislative branch. So there is a little bit of a crunch right now in terms of the people who can actually do the drafting. And so I think that once we see the government shutdown end, which hopefully will be soon, it's going on quite long here, we'll have more technical assistance available to help them craft the legislation. But certainly I think the work is going on in the background. There's been, bills in prior Congresses, there's House legislation. They have a lot to pull from. But I do think the government shutdown is slowing down that process right now.
Kristin, you mentioned something earlier. You said it's not really a concern to you if market structure gets pushed into next year, as long as the legislation is right. Talk to me a little bit more about that, because we've had guests on the show that have said, if it gets pushed into next year, maybe it's deprioritized, and then maybe it doesn't matter if the language is right if it gets deprioritized. How do you kind of square those two things?
Yeah. So here's my thinking on this. And again, this is not in line with the rest of the industry, but I think, number one, as a former Senate staffer and as a longtime crypto lobbyist, like I really want Congress to have a deep understanding of what they're doing. And, you know, despite a lot of effort that's gone in on behalf of the entire industry, I think there's still education that needs to happen. And so I think that that's an important piece of it. I do think, though, we have something going for us that we didn't have going for us in the prior administration. And that is the fact that the SEC and the CFTC, when they're open, which again, they're closed right now, but hopefully will be open again soon, they're doing a lot of thinking about what they can do within the authority they have to provide more clarity and more guidance. So if the SEC comes out and provides a pathway for token fundraising and they provide clarity on what's a security versus a non-security, that's a lot of what we've been asking Congress to do through market structure. And so I think as they're continuing to work on these issues, it might ultimately be easier for Congress if they can leverage that work and expertise, and then they themselves can focus on the issues that Congress clearly needs to do, like spot market regulation or preemption of state laws, et cetera. So I think that in an ideal world, we will have a good, comprehensive, congressionally written legislative solution. But if it doesn't happen, I think, you know, we do have time. I also think these are bipartisan issues. And I think, you know, traditionally, as we get closer to an election, it gets harder to make a deal. But I think that as we saw yesterday in these roundtables, both sides really want to get this done. And so I think, in my opinion, that we have a little bit more time in order to get it right. But that being said, you know, the sooner we get this done, I think the better the industry is going to be.
So I think the specifics of the ultimate bill that comes out of the Senate really matter. And there's a couple there's a couple things that I think are going to be important. One being the balance between the CFTC and the SEC in terms of primary regulator. I had earlier heard from folks in the industry they had a strong preference for the CFTC. That appears to have changed as of late. Also, the extent of preemption is going to matter because states are taking an increasing role. There's more bit license regimes and so on. Can you help us understand, where you see from your vantage point those two questions being resolved in the ultimate bill coming out of the Senate?
Yeah, well, I think what's interesting is one, I know you attended, Renato, that recently the SEC and the CFTC had a roundtable about collaborating on this going forward and harmonizing regulations. I think that kind of dialogue is really important between the two agencies, and hopefully will help provide a framework that is more workable for regulated entities. I do think, that spot markets are traditionally not regulated by the federal government, right? And so if we want to give that to the CFTC, that would be something new for them. If we want to give it to the SEC, it would be something new for them. So I think ultimately where that falls down, it doesn't necessarily matter as long as it's super clear. But one thing that the SEC Chair Atkins has talked about is this concept of a super app. And you want to be able to have one place where you can hold commodity assets and security assets and derivative assets all in kind of one umbrella. And so I think what's interesting is that I think a lot of the way we are going to interact through centralized intermediaries to access crypto assets or assets that have sort of crypto technology wrapped around them, it is all going to be in one place, and they're all going to be regulated by multiple entities. So I think, to me, the key is more the coordination between the two and the harmonization, as opposed to like who ends up with which piece.
Kristin, thanks so much for joining our show today. It was a pleasure. Thanks for sharing your insights from yesterday's discussions. We'll continue following the story, and hopefully we'll have you back on soon.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
That was Solana Policy Institute President. Next guest also attended the Senate Democrat crypto executive meeting yesterday, which was led by Senator Kristin Gillibrand. Senator Mark Warner joins us now. Hello, Senator.
Hey, Jen. Hey, Renato. Thank you for having me on, and hope you guys are doing good.
Thanks for being on. Now, let's get right into it. The industry came to you to push for the House-passed market structure bill. There's been a little bit of back and forth. We had some discussions yesterday. with the industry, as we were just speaking about with our last guest? What are some of your takeaways from the discussions yesterday?
Well, I think, a lot of my colleagues had on the Democratic side, a pretty high level of frustration. And I think the meeting was net very positive. I think there was, one of the things we wanted to share, particularly a lot of the crypto folks, are relatively new to politics, and the idea that 18 of us, and I was intimately involved in the Genius Bill up to my eyeballs, kind of broke with what had been kind of the more traditional Democratic view on crypto and said, no, I'm a believer. This is a critically important industry. We've got to make sure we have the vast majority of it here in America, and we got to have American technology leadership. And I think, while there is always nitpicking after the fact, I think the Genius Bill has gotten so far pretty darn good reviews. And what the frustration then came is, we went against what was the majority of the Democrats in the Senate, and we said, we got to get this done. And then we moved right after that to market structure. And, we frankly think we saw a little bit of bad faith when some documents were leaked to the industry, and the industry then, without picking up the phone and saying, hey, some of this stuff on this document, and matter of fact, I got to tell you, I had not even seen the document before it went out, seems kind of crazy. Instead, the industry went and started publicly blasting folks. And, and Kristin, I'm not saying Kristin by any means herself, but, she knows how the rhythms of the Senate work, and, that doesn't build trust. But I think it was a very positive meeting yesterday. I think we all feel a sense of urgency. I would just say at the front end, let me make two quick other comments. One is that for many of us, and, and my background was all in technology for, 30 plus years, 25 plus years before I got involved in politics. I reminded some of the younger members that, when we talk about American leadership, I was building a cell phone industry in the early 80s, and then was very involved in software companies were building up the internet, and obviously everything related, telecom writ large. That DeFi particularly, it's really complicated. And market structure is exponentially more complicated than stablecoin. So some of this is not slow, but just fully getting this. And I acknowledge that the industry, and my good friend Kirsten Gillibrand, she's very familiar with this. She's years ahead of most of the rest of us. So we're still learning. And then there was a little bit of a mixed message from industry, because a whole lot of industry leaders said, man, this is the most complicated stuff, and you guys got to learn it, and it really is hard. And then in the very next breath, other members would say, but we got to get it done yesterday. And if we accept the premise that this blockchain technology writ large, crypto is an essential component of that, all of the positive outcomes come from that, getting it right, in my mind, is so important. And we're not talking about, months more. We got to get our staffs back in the room. I'm not going to set an arbitrary timeline, because that's how we get crappy product. But I can tell you from my office standpoint and my personal belief, we got to get this done. It's got to be bipartisan. I do think it's one of the reasons why the Ag Committee is taking a little bit longer, because I think they are writing the bill in a bipartisan fashion, which is, frankly, a much fairer and better process than having a partisan-only bill out there that you somehow then have to pick and choose where to amend. I've done a lot of these. I've been in more bipartisan gangs than any member in the Senate, and you got a hell of a lot better product when you write it jointly than when you take a partisan product and then try to amend it.
Senator, you talked a little bit about the traditional Democratic view. Obviously, in many ways, federal regulation of emerging technology is a traditional Democratic view as well, and having a federal regulatory framework. How are you and others like Senator Gillibrand bringing along change in the Democratic Party's perspective, and where do you see the party positioning itself regarding crypto in the months to come in the next election cycle?
Well, first of all, as somebody who I think I've still got I may have crossed over. I've been in elected office longer than I was a business guy, but I was a tech business guy for decades. And I do think, there has been a charge that is too often true that Democrats were overly regulatory, and there's this constant tension between, protecting people and opportunity. And we may have slid, and I fight that battle on a not just in crypto, but in a whole series of domains. Number one. Number two, I do think, and this is kind of where we get into both, asset definition and who will be lead regulators. We don't want to create and reinvent, all of the consumer protections that exist in the securities field. We do understand that many of these items will look a lot more like commodities, and there'll be spot markets you created and secondary markets created, and that still we've got to get right. But as somebody that, again, I go back to when cell phones and wireless was really cool and cutting edge in the 80s. When I first got involved in technology, I started a company called Nextel, started a big VC. If we hadn't had federal preemption, wireless would have never become what it's become. So I get the notion that we need one set of rules and not 50 set of rules, but we got to then make sure the rules at the federal level make sense.
I want to come back to this leaked document that you brought up just a few minutes ago. It was a leaked DeFi proposal from the Democrats. You mentioned that the industry has had a negative response to it. One of the responses was from Uniswap CEO Hayden Adams. He posted on X, quote, "Senate Dems want to kill DeFi entirely." It doesn't sound like that's the case from what you're saying here, but I would like to give you the chance to respond to comments like this. What do you say to these industry CEOs who feel that way?
Well, again, I like Hayden. I've met with him a number of times. He was in the meeting yesterday. I did remind him that I've been doing tech stuff for, unfortunately, to acknowledge this, over 40 years. I know Hayden's not. I think he's going to hit 30 shortly, and which is great that he's got these new ideas. And this is the first time he's been involved in a political process. And again, on the so-called document, I can tell you this: I hadn't seen it. It was a group of 12 offices sending something over as a starting discussion point. And again, it was bad faith that it was leaked. And I would have wished that Hayden or others would have, called me or called some of the other offices and say, some of this stuff here is kind of crazy, and let me tell you why, as opposed to blasting, commentary without even saying, well, what's your basis here? Isn't this crazy? And some of the notion that he has that, things like folks that write code or validators or somehow are going to be swept in, he's just wrong. He's just wrong. So, and again, I think we're in a much better place now. We got to get our staffs back in the room. We got to, work through this. It's frankly, I think it is imminently doable. There are some complex issues. Again, I go back to, there was one comment about smart contracts in the room that one individual from the industry said, well, we should do XYZ with this. And one of my colleagues said, well, do you all agree with that? And 2/3 of the CEO said, holy heck, no, don't, that's totally not the case. So with this, there's still tensions within the industry. This is evolving so quickly. We got to get it right. It can be both things. It can be extraordinarily important, but also extraordinarily complex. And I've been doing this stuff long enough. Rushed, faulty, bad legislation. The very people in the room who want it done yesterday will live to rue that day. And if we don't end up, and just by the nature of the Senate, it's going to have to be bipartisan. But I'd love to keep the 18 senators we had on stablecoin, on Genius, and actually see if we can grow that number, because that will give the industry the long-term assurance that I think they're looking for, and that otherwise, if it still is we had about 1/3 of the Democrats in the Senate, I'd like to see if we can improve on that number.
So you had talked a few moments ago, Senator, about the importance of protecting the public and protecting consumers and so on. One important piece of that is having the regulatory agencies appropriately funded and staffed. Now, there have been some reductions, some serious reductions at the CFTC and the SEC as of late. I know that there was a document you had signed on to, a number of senators had, and one of the issues that was mentioned was increased appropriations. How, do you see that coming out of this process, increased appropriations for the SEC and the CFTC?
If we all agree that crypto blockchain at all is going to try transform finance, and if we all agree, and particularly the industry I know has a little more shifting now, but as you guys acknowledged earlier, they were much more pro CFTC a while back, but CFTC is going to have a big role. You got to have folks that are nimble enough, knowledgeable enough, because I can tell you any legislation is going to leave most of the details to the regulators. And one of the things I made, clear to the White House, and I've had good engagement with the White House on this, is that, we got to make sure that not only the CFTC has appropriate funding, but it's got Democratic commissioners as well. I mean, it's kind of hard for me to go to the, and we know some of the folks who are very much opposed to this effort on the Democratic side, and say, gosh, let's do this. When somebody will say, well, hold on, we don't even have a Democratic member on the regulating body at this point, which is, by the way, the law. You're supposed to have, majority and minority representation. I think the White House gets that. And, while there's not an immediate, there's one of the Democrats on the SEC cycles off in a period. We got to make sure we've got a appropriate, informed, funded regulators, because again, I buy into the notion that this has the potential to be huge. Already is huge, but it has the potential to be exponentially larger. And Lord knows we got to do it here. And if we set the right rules, the rest of the world will follow.
Senator, both you and our previous guest, Kristin, mentioned this education gap when it comes to DeFi in Washington. What do you think needs to happen to close that gap?
Well, I think, and the industry is getting better at kind of reaching out and making the case, but the notion of a truly decentralized entity, when you've got questions of control and questions of custody and who's contributing, and this is gnarly stuff. I'm a tech guy, and it's taken me time to get my head wrapped around it. I do think, having a tech background and a business background, I think the more I think I can be very helpful getting other Democrats. I think most folks would acknowledge that, we got, I was, again, very active on the Genius bill, and I, Kirsten had taken the lead, but I think she would acknowledge as well, we got a lot more Democrats than where we were starting at. So I think I hopefully can play that constructive role again. But it's hard. And again, one of the things I think that's been kind of bubbling beneath, and please don't trust me, but you ought to independently check in with a bunch of Senate Republicans on the banking committee who've been quietly coming to me and saying, Mark, we don't kind of fully understand this stuff either. So, and that's not, and what I beg the industry to hear is that's not trying to slow things down. It's not trying to drag this out. It's trying to acknowledge that, in a field that, there was some debate going back as who is longest in the industry at the round table yesterday, but it's still, it doesn't have a 30-year history. And then for a lot of folks, it's hard and they haven't taken the time. I think everybody's taking the time right now. And I want to get this done as quickly as reasonably possible. And I don't think that most of the issues, frankly, even break down on a traditional liberal conservative background. It's much more of who's going to be, this is a future past deal. Again, Kristin said a little bit, it doesn't mean we got to break all of the past structure, but it does mean you got to be thinking about these issues that don't fit in traditional boxes here. And boy, oh boy, particularly DeFi, I'm a hell of a lot smarter on it today than I was 90 days ago, and much smarter than I was 30 days ago. I'm doing a deep dive.
All right, Senator, we do got to go, but I want to quickly ask you, you said as quickly as reasonably possible. I acknowledge you said you don't want to put a timeline on it, but I got to ask anyways. What are you thinking? As quickly as reasonably
Listen,
possible.
look,
What does
this
that
is-
mean? 6 months,
let's
a
get
year?
let's get the Democratic and Republican staff members back in the room, and all of these deals I've been in, you got to get most of it done to the staff, and then the members got to come in. We had, I think it was an 8 or 10 hour session that, at least on the Democratic side, it was me and Ruben Gallego and Angela Brooks, and Kristin, sat with Bill Haggerty and particularly Cynthia Lummis, and the chairman came in and out, but that wouldn't have been successful if we hadn't done the preliminary work. And when my Republican friends say, well, gosh, we don't even want to meet with you guys until you set a date, that seems to me to be backwards. We because of this snafu on with this document getting out and being leaked again by the Republicans, we lost 2 weeks. That was a shame. Let's get them back in the room. Like this I don't want to sound like I'm a broken record. This is kind of like the same pitch I'm making right now. Please, President Trump, don't go to Asia. Put it off for a day. Sit down and let's get the government reopened, and let's get the healthcare cliff avoided. You're the great deal maker. We can do it in a couple hours.
Senator, on that note, thank you very much for joining us today. It was a pleasure
I
having
hope
you
you
on.
did notice I didn't give you a definitive timeline.
I sure did.
Not your first rodeo, not my first rodeo. But I am very optimistic that once we get folks in the room, I think you're going to be surprised. Because one thing about this, having done this a long time, it's slow, and then it moves very quickly.
Senator, thank you very much. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
That was Senator Mark Warner. All right, we are at the end of our show. Renato, thank you so much for joining me. As always, it was such a pleasure. I'm Jen Sanasi. That's Renato Mariotti. We will